The history of Belfast as a settlement begins during the Iron Age, while its status as a major urban centre dates to the 18th century. Belfast is the capital of Northern Ireland. Belfast was throughout its modern history a major commercial and industrial centre. In the late 20th century its traditional industries, particularly shipbuilding, declined. The city's history has been marked by violent conflict between Catholics and Protestants that caused many areas to split into Catholic and Protestant areas. In recent years the city has been relatively peaceful and major redevelopment has occurred, especially in the inner city and dock areas. Early history the Belfast area has been occupied since at least the Iron Age. The Giant's Ring, a 5,000-year-old henge, is located near the city, and evidence of Bronze and Iron Age occupation have been found in the surrounding hills. One example is McArt's Fort, an Iron Age hill fort located on top of Cavehill north of the city. The original settlement of Belfast was little more than a village, based around the marshy ford where the River Lagan met the River Farset, which is where modern-day High Street meets Victoria Street. The ford of Belfast existed as early as 665 AD, when a battle was fought at the site. The current Church of Ireland church at this location is built on the site of an ancient chapel used by pilgrims crossing the water. The earliest mention of the chapel of the ford is in the papal taxation rolls of 1306. Medieval period in 1177, during the Norman invasion of Ireland, John de Courcy acquired land in eastern Ulster that included the small village of Belfast. To consolidate his power over the area, de Courcy ordered the construction of fortifications in Belfast and nearby Carrickfergus, resulting in the erection of Belfast Castle and Carrickfergus Castle. The original site of Belfast Castle was roughly where modern-day Castle Place and High Street meet in Belfast city centre. The castle was attacked, recovered, destroyed and rebuilt many times. As part of his campaign to establish himself as King of Scotland, Robert Bruce ordered his brother Edward Bruce to invade Ulster in an attempt to divert English military resources. Edward landed at Carrickfergus in 1315 and took the town but not its castle. Some of Ulster's lords and chieftains, including the leader of the O'Neill dynasty, paid homage to Edward, pledging their fealty to him as the King of Ireland. Edward put Belfast Castle under siege that same year, later destroying it. Edward's bid to become the King of Ireland began to unravel and ultimately ended when he was killed in the Battle of Fard in 1318. A replacement building was erected on the site of Belfast Castle only to be dismantled in 1503 by Gerald, Earl of Kildare. Another structure was then built by the local people which Gerald destroyed in 1512. Recent archaeological excavations inside the former Woolworths building beside Castle Place discovered a gully trench with medieval pottery dating the bottom-most strata, highlighting physical evidence that had until then been relatively absent for medieval occupation of the town. The discoveries would have been situated on the south bank of the River Farset. Timbers were also recovered from the Ann Street end of the building which dated to the 16th century. During the Tudor conquest of Ireland, the castle was rebuilt yet again, then fortified in 1552 by the Lord Deputy of Ireland James Croft during the reign of Edward VI. Croft put this new incarnation of the castle under the command of Hugh Mac Neil O'Gay, who was loyal to the English crown. Mac Neil O'Gay was killed by Scottish raiders in 1555 and Belfast Castle was given to Randolphus Lane. Until the late 16th century most of the land surrounding Belfast was still in the hands of the O'Neill clan led by Brian MacPhailem O'Neill. In 1571 this land was granted to Sir Thomas Smith by Elizabeth I, but Smith failed to take control of the area, or to fulfill the requirements of his grant, and so the land reverted to the Crown under James I. Walter Devereux, 1st Earl of Essex, pledged to Queen Elizabeth I that he would conquer parts of Ulster at his own expense. In 1573, he set out on his expedition from Liverpool only to have his convoy get caught in a storm off the coast of Ireland and disperse. Devereux was forced to spend the winter in Belfast. In October 1574, Devereux lured Sir Brian MacPhailem and his entourage under the pretence of negotiations and a feast in MacPhailem's honour at Belfast Castle. Essex then had MacPhailem's retainers killed and took MacPhailem, his wife and his brother into custody, sending them to Dublin where they would later be executed. In 1597, during the 9 Years' War, the English garrison posted at Belfast Castle were captured and killed by Ulster rebels. The castle, village and surrounding area of Lagan Valley were all devastated during the rebellion. Plantation of Ulster, the Glorious Revolution and the Protestant ascendancy in 1603. Gaelic Lord Con O'Neill was holding a feast at his stronghold of Castlereagh. After 3 days of revelry, he and his guests ran out of wine and he took his men into the village of Belfast to replenish their stock. After getting into a quarrel with English soldiers over the confiscated wine, O'Neill was subsequently arrested and thrown into a dungeon at Carrickfergus Castle. O'Neill was then sentenced to death over the wine incident. A secret agreement between O'Neill, Richard Hamilton and Hugh Montgomery, a Scottish lord, saw O'Neill escape from imprisonment. Hamilton seduced the daughter of O'Neill's jailer and Montgomery had Lady O'Neill smuggle in rope set inside large cheesewheel. The rope was then used by O'Neill to escape down the seacliff side of the castle where a boat was waiting. Impressed by his daring, King James I offered O'Neill a pardon on the condition that he divided his lands in Ulster between himself, Montgomery and Hamilton. Montgomery, in turn, encouraged migration of common people from Scotland to Ulster. When King James became officially involved, he made the already occurring movement of people royal policy and escalated the pace and scale. In 1605, Sir Arthur Chichester was made Lord Deputy of Ireland by James I and was later granted lands that included Carrickfergus, Belfast and the Lagan Valley. Belfast was still a small village and was part of an area that was devastated by the 9 Years' War. At that time, Belfast consisted mostly of Scots, English and Manx who were living in timber houses with one inn. Chichester was determined to transform Belfast into a town and set about finding ways to develop the area. He brought masons and smiths over from Britain and ordered the firing of over 1 million bricks. In 1611, he replaced the old castle with one made of stone and timber, building on the same spot as previous fortifications. This would be the final version of Belfast Castle on its original site. The building was destroyed by a fire on 25 April 1708. Instead of building yet another structure at this location, a new stone mansion was constructed on Cavehill in North Belfast in 1870 and dubbed Belfast Castle. This modern, off-site version of the castle still stands today and is a popular tourist attraction. Belfast Castle is situated by the entrance to the Cavehill hiking trails and is often used as a venue for weddings and other formal occasions. After the flight of the Earls left Gaelic Ulster without leadership in 1607, James saw an opportunity to finally Anglicise the province that had hitherto resisted British cultural influence. James set about granting lands and titles to those who were loyal to him in Britain as well as the Gaelic lords he deemed «worthy» in Ireland. James encouraged an increase in migration from Britain to Ulster, promising work and a new life in what he later dubbed the Plantation of Ulster. Though many came from all over the area, the largest response was from lowland Scotland. Scottish migrants came to Ulster in droves, honouring the king's condition to develop existing towns, build roads and found new settlements. The process of mass migration during the plantation saw the eventual emergence of the Ulster Scots. In recognition of his efforts, King James formally granted the town of Belfast and its castle, together with some large estates, to Sir Arthur Chichester in 1612. By letters patent, Chichester was also created Baron Chichester of Belfast. The new importance of Belfast was demonstrated when in 1613 the town was constituted a corporation, of a sovereign, 12 burgesses and a commonalty, with the privilege of sending 2 representatives to Parliament. The first sovereign appointed in Belfast was Thomas Vesey, and the first representatives sent to Parliament were Sir John Blennerhassett, Baron of the Exchequer, and George Trevelyan. Despite Belfast's seemingly growing significance to the English monarchy, it was still very much a small settlement at this stage. John Speed's 1610 map of Ireland marks Belfast as an insignificant village, and the 1612 patent styles it as a town, or village. Nearby Carrickfergus, successfully held by the English for much longer, was still the more prominent settlement and centre for trade. In 1640 Thomas Wentworth, then Lord Deputy of Ireland, purchased the Carrickfergus trade monopolies and bestowed them upon Belfast. The customs house was also relocated to Belfast at around this time. Trade was effectively redirected to Belfast, much to the expense of the prosperity of Carrickfergus. Throughout the 17th century, Belfast was settled by English and Scottish settlers as part of the Plantation of Ulster, of which Arthur Chichester was a major proponent. Many of the new arrivals to Ulster were Presbyterian Protestants and, therefore, not official members of the Church of England. Since they did not have churches of their own, many Scottish Presbyterians found a home in the more permissive Church of Ireland. Because they were more Puritan in their theology, many Ulster Scots preferred to keep their worship style simple and plain. Pursuing conformity, Thomas Wentworth decided to put Northern Protestants more in line with the Church of England and its more elaborate form, which included chants and liturgy. On 10 August 1636, Henry Leslie, Bishop of Down, summoned the Church of Ireland ministers to a meeting in Belfast and rebuked those who had allowed themselves to be influenced by Presbyterianism. The clergy present argued back that they found the Book of Common Prayer and other practices to be too close to Roman Catholicism and «Pope-ish» in nature. Many ministers who refused to implement the bishop's measures would later attempt to find religious freedom in the American colonies, though some were turned back to Scotland by a storm near Newfoundland. Taking advantage of the political turmoil in England that would become the English Civil War, Gaelic Catholics in Ulster revolted in the 1641 rebellion. The town of Lisburn served as a bastion of Protestant Ulster Scots' resistance against Gaelic Catholic insurgents, acting as a buffer for nearby Belfast and Carrickfergus. The rebels were so successful in their rapid taking of land that many of them were perplexed as what to do with it next. The rebellion quickly became chaotic, resulting in Gaelic Catholics committing atrocities and massacres against Protestant civilians in places like Portadown. These heinous acts were eventually reciprocated by Ulster Scots and other British forces, resulting in their own sectarian outrages against Gaelic Catholic people, many of them being civilians. Ulster and, later, Ireland would be overwhelmed by the Irish rebels, resulting in thousands of British settlers be driven out of their homes and thousands more being slaughtered. Much of the north, with the exception of Lisburn, Derry, Enniskillen and Belfast, fell to the insurgents. In the aftermath, the Scottish Parliament sent an army to Ulster to put down the unrest. Many of these soldiers settled in Belfast after the Irish Confederate Wars. Along with the rest of Ireland, Belfast enjoyed peace and prosperity during the Restoration period of Charles II's reign. In 1667, Belfast was producing half of Ireland's butter supply, which was heavily used by the Irish people. Butter also sold at a premium in Europe, with the Dutch paying the highest prices and the French ordering the largest quantities. During the Williamite War in Ireland, Belfast changed hands twice between the competing forces of James II and William of Orange. After being seized by Protestants during an uprising against the rule of the Catholic James II in 1689, it was captured without a fight by Richard Hamilton and the mainly Catholic Irish army following the break of Dromore. Later the same year, a large Williamite expeditionary force arrived in Belfast Lough, landing and taking the major towns of the area before laying siege to Carrickfergus. Belfast was captured by a detachment led by Henry Wharton after the Jacobites had abandoned it without a fight. Schomberg's landing and march to Dundalk Camp, combined with the earlier Jacobite failure at the Siege of Derry, compelled James's forces to withdraw from most of Ulster. Belfast remained in Williamite hands through the end of the war. When Schomberg set up his military camp in Dundalk, his army found themselves pitching their tents next to a bog. The acrid air of the swamp led to many of his soldiers contracting diseases like dysentery, and illness ravaged the camp. Many troops were sent back to the Great Hospital in Belfast for treatment, and a substantial number died in transit. Contemporary accounts describe how some ships were full of only dead men and that some soldiers' limbs were so rotten that they fell off while being bandaged. The debacle resulted in a recorded 3,762 deaths. William of Orange landed in Carrickfergus on 14 June 1690 with a large force consisting of Dutch, German, Danish and French Huguenot soldiers who were reinforced by English raw recruits and Ulster skirmishers. The Ulster Protestants who joined William's army were so ill-equipped that one general remarked that they were half-naked with pistols hanging from their belts. Within hours of landing, William arrived in Belfast to a stunned crowd of unexpecting onlookers. Accounts tell how so many people stared in awed silence at William and his glamorous European nobility that many of William's entourage were unnerved. It wasn't until someone in the gathering had the mind to cheer that applause quickly reverberated through the crowd, to the relief of William's party. William was met by a representative of the Belfast Corporation who implored him to "pull the stiff neck of every papist down." William responded in broken English that he came to see the people of Ireland settled in a lasting peace. William of Orange would go on to defeat James II at the Battle of the Boyne on 12 July 1690. Though not a major skirmish, this confrontation proved to be decisive as, in the course of the battle, James fled the field, eventually leaving Ireland for France. William would also leave Ireland after a disastrous failed assault on the Jacobite-held Limerick city. The war would go on for another year, with the major, decisive engagement coming at the brutal Battle of Aughrim. Over 7,000 men lost their lives during this confrontation, making it the bloodiest battle ever fought on Irish soil. Afterwards, the remaining Jacobite forces left Ireland after a second siege of Limerick, with many volunteering for French military service. With James deposed, William and Mary were crowned joint monarchs on the condition that Parliament could pass stringent measures to protect Protestant Britain from any further Catholic incursions. Harsher penal laws were introduced to enshrine Protestantism in British society and, subsequently, Irish life. Anyone outside of the Anglican Church was subject to fines, arrest and, in extreme circumstances, execution. The political influence of Presbyterians was removed along with nearly all of the Irish Catholic civil rights. Catholics could not hold office, vote or join the military. Catholic property could only be inherited if it were subdivided between sons. Similar to medieval times and the English town settlements, Irish Catholics once again found themselves all but excluded from mainstream society in Ireland. Citing the mismanagement and favoritism shown by James II, Parliament also legislated that Catholics would not be eligible to sit on the throne or be members of the royal family. Another consequence of the penal laws was that Presbyterians were technically not legally married, an issue they took exception to as it insinuated they were engaging in fornication. Presbyterians in Belfast organised and drafted a petition in 1701 which was sent to the Lord Lieutenant in Dublin demanding a repeal of the penal laws. The effects of the penal laws were felt more dynamically in Ireland than in Britain, as the former had a Protestant minority in the midst of a large Catholic majority. Those who gave credence to the Church of Ireland received special consideration, privilege and opportunities. The Irish Parliament in Dublin was almost exclusively Protestant, with only a few Catholic lords being allowed to represent their people. The preferment of Protestants over Catholics and dissenters began a period in Ireland known today as the Protestant ascendancy. Militias, merchants and the industrial town Belfast thrived in the 18th century as a merchant town, importing goods from Great Britain and exporting linen products in increasing volume. Linen at the time was made by small producers in rural areas. Belfast also suffered from the Great Frost followed by drought that hit Ireland in 1740. That winter, Belfast was reported to be covered in snow as the result of a powerful blizzard. On 23 December 1771, grieved by high rents and evictions, the exclusively Protestant Hearts of Steel gang gathered in a meetinghouse in Temple Patrick. The group of mostly farmers armed themselves with pitchforks, fire-lock rifles and pistols and made for nearby Belfast. 1,200 men entered through Belfast's North Gate and surrounded the barracks where a farmer was being held for not paying his rent. Dr. Alexander Haberday, who was in the crowd, made his way to barracks gates in an effort to peacefully negotiate the release of the prisoner. Suddenly, the gates flew open and a detachment of soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 and wounding 9 others. This action resulted in violence across Belfast, which moved to Cunningham's House and Hercules Lane. The sovereign of Belfast believed the whole town to be burning and released the prisoner, fearing further destruction. The revolt spilled over in mid-Ulster, with the Hearts of Oak combining forces with the Hearts of Steel. Eventually, the Irish Parliament had to pass a special act and send troops throughout Ulster to put down the unrest. On 13 April 1778, during the American Revolution, a privateer ship called the Ranger, captained by John Paul Jones, appeared in Belfast Lough. The American ship engaged the Royal Navy vessel that was stationed there, the HMS Dreig. The Dreig was taken and the Sovereign of Belfast, Stuart Banks, sent word to Dublin Castle asking for military assistance. When no help materialised, the Irish began to form their own militias, independent of the government, to defend their land. Though many Ulster Scots had relations in the American colonies which made them sympathetic to their cause, they nonetheless formed into militias for the defence of Ireland from possible invasion. The Volunteer Corps was formed in Belfast in 1778 and was self-financed and free from the military chain of command. Originally created to repel invasion, when no action took place, the Volunteer Corps turned their attentions to the Irish Parliament, pressuring it to reform. In 1780, Belfast became a centre of debate in radical politics, partly because its predominantly Presbyterian population was discriminated against under the penal laws, and also because of the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment. One aim of the new political movement in Ireland included an end to religious discrimination and the enfranchisement of Catholics on an equal level with Protestants. In 1783, Belfast sent delegates to the Irish Parliament in Dublin who attempted to give Catholics voting rights but failed. In 1784, at a convention for the Volunteer Corps, Belfast members defied all the other Irish brigades and declared that they would allow Catholics to join their ranks. Two major developments at the time altered the appearance of Belfast Centre. In 1784 plans were drawn up for the White Linen Hall along with new modern streets. Construction was completed by 1788. In the second half of the 19th century, the city underwent much change. It had started to overtake Carrickfergus as the main settlement in the area. So much so that, at some point, Carrickfergus Loch was renamed as Belfast Loch. Industries were set up and concentrated on Belfast, which resulted in a high level of internal migration to the town. Though Belfast had seen some growth before that. Of the migrants, a fair proportion were Roman Catholics from the west of Ulster, settling mostly in the west of Belfast. Until that point Belfast had been overwhelmingly Protestant. Towards the end of the 18th century, money was raised by collections from both the Presbyterian and Church of Ireland congregations of the town and, together with monies donated by Protestant businessmen, enough was raised to erect the first Roman Catholic church in Belfast, St Mary's in Chapel Lane. A couple of years later, at the opening and first Mass on 30 May 1784, the mostly Presbyterian First Belfast Volunteer Company paraded to the chapel yard and gave the parish priest a guard of honour, with many of the Protestants of Belfast also present and sharing the event. At the time, the Roman Catholic population of Belfast was only around 400. It would rise to some 45,000 by 1886. In 1786 the River Farset was covered over to create High Street and the ford across the Lagan was removed. In 1789, upon learning of the first waves of uprising in France, the Belfast Telegraph published an editorial praising what would become the French Revolution and its ideals. Then, in 1790, inspired by the events in France, a movement led by Presbyterians lobbied the Irish Parliament for reform. The Northern Whig Party was formed. In July 1791, volunteers gathered at the Exchange on Waring Street in Belfast to celebrate the fall of the Bastille. They marched to the White Linen Hall where they fired a volley salute to the French revolutionaries. A declaration was presented extolling the French people and invited their support for revolution in Ireland. This led to the founding of the Society of United Irishmen by Theobald Wolfe Tone, Henry Joy McCracken and others. The first meeting of the United Irishmen was exclusively attended by Protestants. The Society of United Irishmen proved to be a more radical nationalist group vying for further independence, an end to religious discrimination and equal representation for Catholics in Ireland. When the Reign of Terror began in France in 1793, it split the United Irishmen with some condemning the violence and others applauding the action being taken to further revolution. Protestants in Ulster who endorsed enfranchisement soon found that they knew next to nothing about their Catholic neighbours. Wolfe Tone noted in his diary that many Protestants were ignorant of the lifestyle of Catholics. This led to the organising of the Harp Gathering in Belfast in 1792 where Gaelic poetry, art, music and language were celebrated. In May 1795, after being implicated in treasonous activity, Wolfe Tone and his family were in Belfast awaiting a ship that would take them into exile. Tone was invited to many dinner parties and excursions by local society. One such outing was a hike up the Cavehill overlooking the town of Belfast and surrounding areas. It was atop the cliff that Tone and his compatriots vowed that they would not rest until Ireland was free from the British yoke. Tone's Belfast Presbyterian supporters raised funds to buy his family a small tobacco farm in New Jersey. In 1796, France launched an armada carrying over 45,000 men to Ireland, only to be prevented from landing by bad weather. The United Irishmen and Catholic defenders were sensationalized by the attempted French invasion and their recruitment doubled in Ulster in 1797. The British government, fearing insurrection, moved to disarm the people beginning with Ulster. Lieutenant Gerard Lake wrote in his journal that, "Nothing but terror will keep them in order." It is plain that every act of sedition originates in this town. In March 1797, Lake proclaimed martial law and ordered the citizenry to surrender their arms. Weapon searches began in Belfast and Carrickfergus, with more than 5,000 arms seized in the first 10 days. Due to spies infiltrating nearly every level of the United Irishmen, Lake was able to capture the organization's leadership, who were transported to Dublin from Belfast. The now General Lake would go on to devastate the United Irishmen's ranks while, at the same time, doing nothing to disarm Loyalist Orangemen. In 1798, General Sir Ralph Abercrombie was appointed Commander-in-Chief in Ireland. Abercrombie toured Ireland and realized quickly that Lake's forces were out of control and that their brutal tactics were pushing more and more of the populace into rebellion. Abercrombie formally censured the Irish Army, which outraged leading members of the Irish government, who responded by forcing Abercrombie to resign and Lake to take his place. As a result of Lake's continually harsh methods, the population rose up in revolt, culminating in the Irish Rebellion of 1798. On 17 July 1798, United Irishman revolutionary leader Henry Joy McCracken was tried on Ann Street. When the Crown prosecutor offered him his life in exchange for the names of the other rebel leaders, McCracken refused. He was then led to Market House at High Street and Cornmarket, where he was hanged. Act of Union, direct rule and rapid growth as a consequence of the Rebellion of 1798 and the reorganisation of Britain and Ireland into the United Kingdom, the Irish Parliament was pressured to abolish itself. From that point on, Irish representatives would be sent to Westminster and direct rule would be imposed. Many in Ireland were sceptical of these events, especially when equal rights for Catholics failed to materialise. Presbyterians were also wary of the new United Kingdom. But, within a generation many of these Protestants became ardent supporters of the Union, having benefited from it economically. In the 19th century, Belfast became Ireland's preeminent industrial city, with industries in linen, heavy engineering, tobacco and shipbuilding dominating trade. Belfast, being situated at the western end of Belfast Lough and at the mouth of the River Lagan, was an ideal location for the shipbuilding industry, which would eventually manifest in the Harland and Wolff Company. Harland and Wolff were one of the largest shipbuilders in the world, employing up to 35,000 workers. Beginning in the early 19th century, migrants seeking work came to Belfast from across Ireland, Scotland and England, but particularly from rural Ulster, where sectarian tensions ran deep. The same period saw the first outbreaks of sectarian riots, which have recurred regularly since. Belfast was the one place on the island where the Industrial Revolution had permanent effect. Belfast Lough was a system of activity receiving by sea fuel and raw materials for its various industries. Cotton was spun by steam machine or water power into mill yarn, which was then taken to hand-loom weavers along the River Lagan in places like McArt and the Catholic Short Strand in East Belfast. It was calculated that, by 1811, there were 150,000 power spindles producing over 70 million lengths of yarn, employing about 30,000 people. 1,000-ton ships brought 6,000 tons of coal a year to keep the mills powered. The Belfast cotton industry began to lose momentum after demand decreased at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Then, it was discovered in Preston, England, that deep-soaked flax could be made into yarn by power spinning machine in 1825. Mulholland's cotton mill on York Street was accidentally burned down in 1828 and rebuilt and upgraded to spin deep-soaked flax. This mill was enormous. 5 stories high with 3 steam engines, 15,300 spindles and a 186-foot tall chimney. The mill would render 700 tons of yarn from flax each year, making a massive profit. Following their example, other flax mills were eventually built throughout Belfast. Industry made Belfast the fastest-growing urban centre in the United Kingdom, with the population increasing from 19,000 in 1801 to over 70,000 in 1841. By 1836, Belfast had a vibrant Chamber of Commerce and top-level banking network, which included the Northern Bank, Ulster Bank and Belfast Bank. Though it added to the prosperity of Belfast and its surrounding areas, this mechanized production of material combined with imports from England devastated the cottage industries in Ireland, who failed to compete. This would later contribute to rural families depending on the potato crop as a staple of their diet, which would have disastrous results in the Great Famine of the 1840s. For the Battle of the Boyne commemorations on 12 July 1829, Orange Institution parades in Belfast were banned, leading to demonstrations and serious rioting in the city.
These spread to County Armagh and County Tyrone, lasting several days and resulting in at least 20 deaths.
In July 1837, the steam locomotives, Express, and Fury, were delivered to Belfast Harbour from Manchester and were drawn up from Belfast docks by horse to eventually be placed on the new railway line laid between Belfast and Lisburn. Nearly 1,600 spectators gathered at 4 a.m. to watch the test runs of each machine.
Later, local Presbyterian clergy would condemn the running of trains on Sundays, saying, its business was sending souls to the devil at the rate of 6 pence apiece. The general public largely ignored these protests by the ministers and rode the train. Daniel O'Connell launched his Repeal the Act of Union movement in 1840 and was invited to speak in Belfast in January 1841. Reverend Henry Cook, spokesman for Northern Presbyterians, said that «repeal» was «just a discreet word for Rome-ish ascendancy and Protestant extermination». He went on to comment that O'Connell was a «great, bad man engaged in a great, bad cause». O'Connell abandoned his plans to enter Belfast in the midst of a large crowd of supporters. Anticipating trouble, troops and artillery were called into town to quell any unrest. O'Connell slipped into Belfast on 16 January in disguise. He did not attempt to leave his hotel in Donegal Place to attend Mass. He appeared on the balcony of Kearns Hotel on 19 January to speak to a crowd while wearing a flamboyant, repeal-themed outfit complete with white velvet collar and embroidered shamrocks, wolf-hounds and round towers. The crowd was mixed with people either jeering or cheering O'Connell in a cacophony of sound so loud that O'Connell's speech could not be heard. That night, O'Connell attended an event in the May Street Music Hall, while some Belfast locals outside pelted each other with stones outside and others smashed windows. One stone went through the window at the Kearns Hotel, where O'Connell was staying, and shattered the great chandelier inside. At the office of the Vindicator, the Repeal Journal in Belfast, it was reported that hardly a pane of glass was left unbroken by rioters who had to be repelled by the police. O'Connell left Belfast the next day escorted by 4 cars full of police. A few days later, Reverend Cook, speaking to a crowd of supporters, extolled the growth of industry and population in Belfast and connected its prosperity directly to its being a part of the United Kingdom. Famine, Queen Victoria and Harland and Wolff during the Great Famine, a potato blight that originated in America spread to Europe, decimated crops in Ireland. A Belfast newspaper predicted the devastating effect the blight would have on the common people of Ireland, particularly in rural areas. The potato crop in 1845 largely failed all over Ireland with the exception of the west coast and parts of Ulster. 1/3 of the crop was inedible and fears that those spuds in storage were contaminated were soon realised. In October 1846, a Belfast journal, The Vindicator, made an appeal on behalf of the starving, writing that their universal cry was, "Give us food or we perish." The publication went on to scold the United Kingdom for not meeting the basic needs of its people. By 1847, the British government were feeding 3 million famine victims a day, though many were still succumbing to disease brought on by starvation. Many of the poor moved eastward from rural areas into Belfast and Dublin, bringing with them famine-related diseases. Dr. Andrew Malcolm, who was working in Belfast at the time, wrote of the influx of the starving into the town, their horrific appearance and the plague breath they carried with them. The Belfast newsletter reported in July 1847 that the town's hospitals were overflowing and that some of the emaciated were stretched out on the streets, dead or dying. On 10 July 1849, the Belfast Harbour Commissioners, members of the council, gentry, merchants and the 13th Regiment officially opened the Victoria Channel aboard the royal steamer Prince of Wales. This new waterway allowed for large vessels to come up the River Lagan regardless of tide level. After a signal was given, a flotilla of seacraft moved up the channel to the adulation of the large crowds that had gathered to watch the event. The spectacle was concluded by a cannon salute and a resounding chorus of "Rule Britannia" by all those present. This new channel fed the growth of Belfast industry, enabling new development, despite being completed during the last years of the Great Famine. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert along with the Prince of Wales visited Belfast in August 1849, sailing up Victoria Channel and venturing into the town. They were received jubilantly by the people of Belfast with fanfare and decorations adorning the streets.
The royal family moved up High Street amidst rapturous cheers and well-wishing. On the same street, a 32-foot-high arch had been built with a misspelled rendering of Irish Gaelic greeting, Said Mile Fealty, written on it. In the White Linen Hall, the Queen viewed an exhibition of Belfast's industrial goods. The royals would make their way to the Lisburn Road and the Malone Turnpike where Victoria inspected the new Queen's College. After touring Mulholland's Mill, Victoria and her entourage returned to their vessel. Belfast was recovering from a cholera epidemic at the time of the royal visit, and many credited Victoria and Albert with lifting the spirits of the town during a difficult period. Conditions for the new working class were often squalid, with much of the population packed into overcrowded and unsanitary tenements. The city suffered from repeated cholera outbreaks in the mid-19th century. Though both Catholics and Protestants were often employed, Protestants would experience preferment over their Catholic counterparts. Hardly any of those in management were Catholic, and Protestants would often receive promotion and desirable positions.
Working-class Catholics were the only group on the whole to experience adverse poverty during this period.
Though there were Catholics and Protestants at all levels of society, it was often said, "There are no Protestants in the slums." Conditions improved somewhat after a wholesale slum clearance program in the 1900s. Belfast was becoming one of the greatest places for trade in the Western world. In 1852, Belfast was the first port of Ireland, outpacing Dublin in both size, value and tonnage. However, old sectarian tensions would soon come to the fore, resulting in an almost annual cycle of summer rioting between Catholics and Protestants. On 12 July 1857, confrontations between crowds of Catholics and Protestants degraded into throwing stones on Albert Street, with Catholics beating two Methodist ministers in the Millfield area with sticks. The next night, Protestants from Sandy Row went into Catholic areas, smashed windows and set houses on fire. The unrest turned into 10 days of rioting, with many of the police force joining the Protestant side. There were also riots in Derry, Portadown and Lurgan. Firearms were produced, with sporadic gunfire happening all over Belfast. The police could do little to mitigate the turmoil. The riots of 1864 were so intense that reinforcements and 2 field guns were dispatched from Dublin Castle. A funeral for a victim of police gunfire was turned into a loyalist parade that unexpectedly went up through Donegal Place in the heart of Belfast. Police barely held as a barrier between the Protestants marching through Belfast's main streets and the irate Catholics who were massing at Castle Place. Continuous gunfire resounded throughout the city until a deluge of summer rain dispersed most of the crowd. The mud that was dredged up to dig the Victoria Channel was made into an artificial island, called Queen's Island, near East Belfast. Robert Hickson, an engineer from Liverpool who managed the arms work on Cromack Street, decided to use his surplus of iron ore to make ships. Hickson hired Edward Harland from Newcastle on Tyne to assist in the endeavour. Harland launched his first ship in October 1855. His cutting-edge designs would go on to revolutionize the shipbuilding world. In 1858, Harland would buy out Hickson with the backing of Gustav Schwab. Schwab's nephew, Gustav Wolff, had been working as an assistant to Harland. They formed the Partnership of Harland and Wolff in 1861. Business was booming with the advent of American Civil War and the Confederacy purchasing steamers from Harland and Wolff. Gustav Schwab would go on to create the White Star Line in 1869. He ordered all of his ocean vessels from Harland and Wolff, setting the firm on the path to becoming the biggest shipbuilding company in the world. Harland and Wolff would go on to build some of the world's most famous ships, including HMHS Britannic, RMS Oceanic, RMS Olympic and, best known of all, the RMS Titanic. Home Rule and the City Charter. In 1862, George Hamilton Chichester, 3rd Marquess of Donegal, built a new mansion on the slopes of Cavehill above the town. Named as the New Belfast Castle, it was designed by Charles Lanyon and construction was completed in 1870. By 1901, Belfast was the largest city in Ireland. The city's importance was evidenced by the construction of the lavish City Hall, completed in 1906. As noted, around 1840 its population included many Catholics, who originally settled in the west of city, around the area of today's Berwick Street, which was known as the Pound Loney. West Belfast remains the centre of the city's Catholic population. Other areas of Catholic settlement have included parts of the north of the city, especially Ardoyne and the Antrim Road, the markets area immediately to the south of the city centre, and the Short Strand. During the summer of 1872, about 30,000 nationalists held a demonstration at Haniston in Belfast, campaigning for the release of Fenian prisoners, which led to another series of riots between Catholics and Protestants.
In 1874, the issue of Home Rule became mainstream in Irish politics. A conglomeration of MPs were denounced by the Belfast Newsletter on the eve of election, writing that Home Rule was simply Rome Rule, and that Protestants would not support a new Dublin Parliament. In June 1886, Protestants celebrated the defeat of the first Home Rule Bill in the House of Commons, leading to rioting on the streets of Belfast and the deaths of 7 people, with many more injured. In the same year, following the 12th Orange Institution parades, clashes took place between Catholics and Protestants, and also between Loyalists and police.
13 people were killed in a weekend of serious rioting which continued sporadically until mid-September with an official death toll of 31 people. For more information see 1886 Belfast riots. Although the county borough of Belfast was created when it was granted city status by Queen Victoria in 1888, the city continues to be viewed as straddling County Antrim and County Down, with the River Lagan generally being seen as the line of demarcation. Charles Vane Tempest Stewart made a grand visit to Belfast on behalf of the Queen to give it official recognition as a city. Belfast at this time was Ireland's largest city and the third most important port in the United Kingdom, the leader in world trade at the time. Belfast had become a world-class industrial city and the centre of linen production for the whole planet. In 1896, a second Home Rule Bill passed through the House of Commons but was struck down in the House of Lords. Wary Protestants celebrated and, as had happened 7 years earlier, Catholics took exception to Protestant triumphalism and rioted. On 14 January 1899, large crowds gathered to watch the launch of the RMS Oceanic, which had been ordered by the White Star Line for the transatlantic passenger travel. The Oceanic was the largest man-made moving object that had ever been built up to that time. By the year 1900, Belfast had the world's largest tobacco factory, tea machinery and fan-making works, handkerchief factory, dry dock and colour Christmas card printers. Belfast was also the world's leading manufacturer of fizzy drinks. Belfast was by far the greatest economic beneficiary in Ireland of the Act of Union and Industrial Revolution. The city saw a bitter strike by dock workers organised by radical trade unionist Jim Larkin, in 1907. The dispute saw 10,000 workers on strike and a mutiny by the police, who refused to disperse the strikers' pickets. Eventually the army had to be deployed to restore order. The strike was a rare instance of non-sectarian mobilization in Ulster at the time. The Ulster Covenant and rising tensions at the beginning of the 20th century, 75% of Belfast's population was Protestant and opposed the notion of Home Rule. However, the same percentage of Ireland as a whole were Catholic and for the re-establishment of a parliament in Dublin. Irish Unionists chose Edward Carson, a lawyer and former Conservative MP for Trinity College Dublin, as their leader in 1910. Carson had previously gained notoriety in 1895 for intensely cross-examining Oscar Wilde during his trial, which led to Wilde's conviction. In September 1911, Carson addressed Unionist men and members of the Orange Order in Strandtown, East Belfast. He derided the Home Rule movement as a «conspiracy against free people», and called on all men to be ready to establish a government for Protestant Ulster. From 1910, Unionists, led by Edward Carson, raised a militia, the Ulster Volunteers, to resist Home Rule by force if necessary. The Ulster Unionist Council secretly requested a quotation from a German arms manufacturer for 20,000 rifles and 1 million rounds of ammunition. In 1911, Carson and the UCC voted for the first disbursement of funds to be used in the acquisition of arms. The political crisis heightened tensions in Belfast and rioting took place in July 1911. Conservative Party leader, Bonar Law visited Belfast on Easter Tuesday 1912. Special trains brought over 100,000 Unionist demonstrators who paraded past the stage in turn at the Balmoral grounds in Belfast. Those gathered then observed prayers led by the Church of Ireland Archbishop of Armagh and the Presbyterian moderator. The largest Union Jack ever created was the unfurled, and Bonar Law gave a speech comparing contemporary Unionists with their forebears who were besieged in Derry in 1689. 2 days later, on the 11th of April 1912, the Prime Minister H. Asquith introduced the Home Rule Bill in the Commons. The third Home Rule Bill was proposed by the Liberal government and would have granted limited autonomy to an all-Ireland Irish Parliament. On 28 September 1912, Protestant Unionists met in the Ulster Hall in Belfast to inaugurate the celebration of Ulster Day, and protest the third Home Rule Bill.
Presbyterian minister Dr. William McKean gave a sermon where he stated that the Irish question is, at bottom, a war against Protestantism.
It is an attempt to establish a Roman Catholic ascendancy in Ireland. To begin the disintegration of the empire by securing a second parliament in Dublin. He went on to remark that the Ulster Covenant was a measure that would protect the Protestant people from any incursion by those who would seek their undoing. From there and many other meeting places across the city, Irish Unionists converged on Belfast City Hall at noon, led by Edward Carson and other city officials. Carson proceeded to a round table draped in the Union flag where he was the first to sign the Ulster Covenant. The signing was then opened to the general public to the relief of the stewards who struggled to control the eager crowd. People continued to sign after the Covenant past 11 p.m. with women signing their own separate declaration. Signatures totaled 471,414 men and women who could prove they were born in Ulster. Contrary to popular myth, no one actually signed in their own blood, instead, some made their mark in red ink. After leaving City Hall, Edward Carson's car was pulled along by the hands of the elated crowd as he made his way to the Belfast docks. After boarding a ship to the sound of a rifle salute from the Fusiliers, Carson was destined for Britain where he planned to continue the Ulster Unionist campaign. Carson addressed the cheering throng, saying, "I ask you while I'm away in England and Scotland and fighting your battle in the Imperial Parliament, to keep the flag flying. And no surrender." Bonfires were lit all through the city. The largest conflagration was seen from the Cavehill overlooking the entire area. Many people in the general public as well as the government did not realize previously how in earnest the Protestants of Ireland were regarding unionism. The Ulster Covenant served to remove all illusion about their staunch opposition to Home Rule. On 13 November 1912, the House of Commons found itself in tumult as tempers flared during the debate over the third Home Rule Bill. H. Asquith declared his intention of seeing the bill being put through the Commons. Jeers of "traitor" and other slurs were shouted in the uproar. Conservative and Unionist MPs chanted, "Resign! Resign!" and "Civil War" at Asquith. From the benches, Ron McNeill threw a bound copy of the Standing Orders at the Home Secretary, Winston Churchill, striking him in the head. However, despite the strong protestations from some in Parliament, the Home Rule Bill passed in early 1913. Under the pretense of defending Ulster by any means necessary, the Ulster Volunteer Force was founded shortly after and grew to 90,000 men by the end of that year. Padraic Pearse, an Irish Republican and then head of St Enda's Boys' School in Dublin, said, "Personally I think the Orangeman with a rifle is a much less ridiculous figure than the nationalist without a rifle." On 25 November 1913, Owen McNeill formed the Irish Volunteers in Dublin in direct response to the events in Ulster. 12 of the 30 men in leadership of the Irish Volunteers were also secret members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, dedicated to arm rebellion against Britain. As a result of the formation of both Unionist and Nationalist militias and the heightened political tensions, many observers predicted that civil war in Ireland was imminent. Third Home Rule Bill, World War and Partition 1912–1921. In 1914, after failing to pass an amendment to the Third Home Rule Bill a year earlier, Asquith attempted to avoid civil war in Ireland by introducing several measures proposing that Ireland be partitioned. Unionists demanded that the 6 northeastern counties of Ireland be excluded from Home Rule. The idea was suggested that any county wanting to opt out of Home Rule may do so for a period of 6 years. To this, Edward Carson retorted, "We do not want a sentence of death with a stay of execution of 6 years." He would go on to challenge the British government in Westminster on implementing Home Rule as Ulster, after which, Carson left for Belfast to set up a provisional government. Fearing that the UVF would seize control of the province, Asquith had Churchill order a naval cordon in the Irish Sea. A flotilla set sail and troops were dispatched from all over Ireland into Ulster to prevent an uprising. 60 cavalry officers from the Curragh base in Co. Kildare refused to obey the orders, saying they would prefer to be dismissed rather than lead their men against Ulster loyalists. Their commanding officer assured them in writing that they would not move against the loyalists militarily, for which he was dismissed by Asquith. The delay alerted the UVF, who quietly moved their headquarters to the heavily sandbagged home of James Craig, called Craigavon in East Belfast. In April 1914, a shipment of 24,000 rifles with 5 million rounds of ammunition, or 216 tons, arrived in Ireland. The arms had been smuggled from Germany, transferred to a smaller vessel in Wexford and transported up the coast to Ulster. The shipment went undetected as the authorities were distracted by a decoy ship in Belfast Lough which allowed the real vessel to be unloaded near Larne and arms to be dropped for collection throughout the area. Alarmed by the events up north, the almost defunct Irish Republican Brotherhood was revitalized and, as a direct response to the actions of the UVF, a new generation of Republicans joined the IRB's ranks. John Redmond suspected that the Irish Volunteers was secretly being controlled by the IRB from within and moved to take over of the militia but failed. Observing the success of the UVF to arm, the Irish Volunteers also contacted gun manufacturers in Germany to purchase arms. King George V, fearing civil war, became involved and sponsored peace talks in Ulster, which eventually broke down.
Edward Carson believed that war was inevitable, saying, "We shall have once more to asset the manhood of our race." Outside of the United Kingdom, political tensions resulting from nationalist movements in various European countries were causing diplomatic relations to deteriorate between nations. While considering the various possible outcomes that might result from going to war, some of Germany's generals expressed their belief that the British military would be too preoccupied with civil war in Ireland to respond to anything else happening in Europe.
On 3 August 1914, German troops crossed the border into Belgium, signifying the beginning of World War I. That night, speaking in the Commons, John Redmond declared that all of the King's troops could be withdrawn from Ireland, that nationalists of the south would join arms with that of the Ulstermen in the north. The men of both the UVF and Irish Volunteers by and large joined the British Army in the war against Germany and its allies. Recruitment posters imploring men to join the Irish regiments and reminded them that their first duty was to their king, regardless of their personal politics. The Great War served to temporarily unite Irishmen in common cause as droves from both sides enlisted and marched together. Edward Carson offered full cooperation and declared that, "England's difficulty is not Ulster's opportunity. We do not seek to purchase terms by selling our patriotism." Though they did not care for each other, Carson offered the UVF militia to General Herbert Kitchener, commander of the British forces, with no terms attached. To Carson's surprise, Kitchener agreed to keep the UVF together as the 36th Ulster Division with its command structure mostly intact. Redmond urged the Irish Volunteers to fight and defend Ireland as well as the more abstract ideals of freedom and religious equality. By this, he meant joining forces with the British and fighting for the king. Owen MacNeill refused to fight for the British overseas, lead a minority of 11,000 to form their own militia taking the name, Irish Volunteers, in the split. The majority group led by Redmond rebranded as the National Volunteers. By early 1916, at least 210,000 Irishmen had enlisted. One-third of the UVF joined and, though Ulster supplied more than half of the Irish recruits, 57% of those who came from Ireland were Catholic. In Belfast, Catholics were more likely to join the military than Protestants. Nearly 28,000 of those who joined to fight in France would never return to Ireland. Ireland's economy flourished in the first years of the Great War as mills, factories and manufacturers received government contracts and did all they could to keep up with demand from the British military. In April 1916, amidst the financial rise, a revolt was launched in Dublin by the Irish Volunteers and Irish Citizens' Army in an event that would come to be known as the Easter Rising. At the time, the event was labelled the Sinn Féin Rebellion, which has since been corrected as Sinn Féin were not involved. The closed military trials and hasty executions in the aftermath of the Rising transformed the rebel leaders into martyrs, which then served to turn the Irish nationalist public against the British establishment. It is believed that the rebels of 1916 were counting on the British military to overreact and that they would be required to give their lives to expose what they saw as the callous, brutal attitude of the British Empire towards its Irish subjects.
Even Edward Carson condemned the covert trials and executions, stating that no true Irishman calls for vengeance. Carson justifiably feared that a new generation of Republican martyrs was being created that would add momentum to their cause.
In July 1916 in France, the 36th Ulster Division was one of the first units to attack German positions during a charge at dawn after a 6-day British artillery barrage. The bombardment, however, did not have the desired effect as much of the German barbed wire and machine gun nests were left intact. Despite this, the Ulster Division advanced with remarkable speed, crashing in force into the German Fourth Line. The Ulstermen were under intense fire from the German machine guns and some were accidentally shelled by their own side. On what would be the first day of the Battle of the Somme, Britain suffered over 54,000 casualties. The Ulster Division alone had 5,700 killed or wounded. The battle continued through the summer and into September when the 36th Ulster Division found themselves fighting alongside the 16th Division composed of mostly Southern, nationalist Irishmen. In that same year, the Ulster Unionist Council agreed that their goal would be the exclusion of the 6 northeastern counties from the Dublin Parliament. Because many Irish nationalists would refuse to take an oath of allegiance to the king, thus disqualifying themselves from government positions, Unionists were able to fill the void they left and gain more and more political influence in Ireland. Following the end of the Great War in 1918, issues of Irish independence and the partition of Ireland again came to prominence. The separatist Sinn Féin party won a majority of seats in Ireland, though not in Ulster, where Belfast nationalists continued to vote for members of the Irish Parliamentary Party and Unionists for the Unionist Party. Representatives of Sinn Féin refused to sit in the House of Commons, citing their belief that the British had no legitimate right to rule in Ireland. Because they adopted a policy of abstention, the Commons only had the small contingent of the Irish Party representing Irish nationalism. Easily outnumbered by Irish Unionists, the Ulster Unionist Council were able to attain nearly all of their constitutional aims for Ulster. The result was a separate territory that would be as large as Unionists could control under their own parliament and jurisdiction. Under the terms of the agreement, 6 of Ulster's 9 counties would be partitioned into a territory to be called Northern Ireland, and administered by a separate Belfast Parliament, with the remaining 26 counties being known as Southern Ireland, and ruled by a semi-autonomous Dublin Parliament. Unionists portrayed themselves as making a great sacrifice by conceding 26 counties, 3 of which were part of Ulster. In reality, the arrangement actually suited their interests as it consolidated their power as a Protestant majority over the north. Some British authorities assumed that having 2 home rule parliaments in Ireland would be an agreeable compromise for nationalists. Counties Tyrone and Fermanagh had nationalist majorities yet were to be included in Northern Ireland. Despite Edward Carson suggesting that the 4 most Protestant counties would be viable in 1914, Unionists persisted in including these counties as part of the desired 6. On 23 December 1920, amidst political unrest, the Government of Ireland Act 1920 entered the statute book, officially creating the province of Northern Ireland. Edward Carson privately disagreed with the idea of partition and the devolution of Ulster. Claiming poor health, Carson retired from public life and gave the leadership of the Ulster Unionists to James Craig. Elections on 24 May 1921 saw returns that gave Unionists a landslide victory by winning 40 seats. James Craig became the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. Partition did little to settle political turmoil in Ireland. Many Irish Republicans rejected the British Dublin Parliament and, instead, Sinn Féin took their majority and founded their own separatist assembly, the Dáil Éireann. From January 1919, guerrilla fighting between the security forces and the Irish Republican Army increased, eventually escalating into the Anglo-Irish War. With the creation of Northern Ireland, violence in Ireland only intensified, though conflict would take on 2 distinct natures in the north and in the south. Conflict in Belfast 1920–1922. The periods immediately before and after partition were marked by major sectarian violence in Belfast, as some areas more dominated by one of the 2 communities. While occurring simultaneously with the Irish War of Independence, the unrest in Northern Ireland had an identity all of its own, with much of the violence happening independently of events in the south. Unlike the rest of Ireland, where the war was largely fought between the IRA and Crown forces, around 90% of the 465 deaths in Belfast were civilian on civilian. Violence occurred in the form sectarian assassinations and reprisals on random victims. Open, armed clashes between Catholic and Protestants often occurred in the city streets.
This particular round of conflict originated in Derry in June 1920 when Catholics burned Protestant homes in the Bogside area of the city after Protestants burned Catholic homes in the Waterside. The
Ulster Volunteer Force was revamped to respond to the threat using machine guns to fire randomly into the Catholic Bogside, resulting in several deaths. On 21 July 1920, rioting broke out in Belfast, starting in the shipyards and spreading to residential areas. The violence was partly in response to the IRA killing of a Northern Rick police officer Gerald Smith, in Cork, and also because of competition over jobs due to the high unemployment rates.
Protestant loyalists marched on the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast and forced over 11,000 Catholic and left-wing Protestant workers from their jobs.
This sectarian action is often referred to as the Belfast pogrom. The sectarian rioting that followed resulted in about 20 deaths in just 3 days. Both Catholics and Protestants were expelled from their homes by the other side, sometimes by fire. The further IRA assassination of Enric Detective Swansea in nearby Lisburn on the 22nd of August prompted another round of clashes, in which 33 people died in 10 days. The year 1921 saw 3 major flare-ups in Belfast. Just before the truce that formally ended the Irish War of Independence, Belfast suffered a day of violence known at the time as Belfast's Bloody Sunday. An IRA ambush of an armoured police truck on Raglan Street killed 1 Rick man, injured 2 more and destroyed their armoured car. This sparked ferocious fighting in West Belfast on the following day, Sunday 10 July, in which 16 civilians lost their lives and 161 houses were destroyed. Gun battles raged all day along the sectarian boundary between the Falls and Shankill roads. Rival gunmen used rifles, machine guns and hand grenades. 4 more would die over the following 2 days. The second spike in violence happened from 29 August to 1 September, in which 20 people were killed. The third eruption was in November, when more than 30 died in response to the IRA bombing city trams taking Protestant workers to the shipyards, killing 7 people. King George V offered to open Northern Ireland's Parliament on the 22nd of June 1921. The king made this decision hoping to quell the continual violence that raged in places like Belfast and Derry. Prime Minister David Lloyd George saw the occasion as an opportunity to include Sinn Féin. When the king arrived, Belfast was awash with British flags, royal portraits and cheering throngs. George V addressed a gathering of Unionists and their wives in Belfast City Hall. In his speech, the king expressed his hope that his presence in Ireland would help put an end to strife of the people regardless of their race or creed. He went on to implore all the Irish to forgive and live with each other in peace and harmony. The king later privately remarked that he was very glad he came to Northern Ireland, though many of his advisers were against the idea. The day after the monarch's departure, the IRA blew up a train carriage carrying the king's cavalry escort en route to Dublin, killing 4 men and 80 horses. A truce was then agreed and came into effect on the 11th of July 1921, opening negotiations between Irish Republicans and the British government. Negotiations saw the establishment of a boundary commission to reconsider the border between Northern Ireland and the south, the possibility of the 26 counties being given status as a «free state», and the requirement of an oath of allegiance for all Irishmen. Both Craig and Carson vehemently opposed the Boundary Commission, fearing it would greatly diminish the existing area of Northern Ireland. The truce had little effect in the north as violence peaked in the first half of 1922, after the Anglo-Irish Treaty confirmed the partition of Ireland into Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State. Michael Collins, a leader in the Republican movement and commander of the IRA, covertly sent arms and aid to the Northern IRA with the aim both of defending the Catholic population there and sabotaging the government of Northern Ireland in hopes of its collapse. Loyalists recognized the IRA's tactic of subversion and openly attacked Catholic neighborhoods, which were somewhat defended by IRA gunmen. Roughly 30 people were killed in Belfast in February 1922, 60 in March and another 30 in April. Recurring cycles of violence continued until the summer of 1922. In response to this most recent conflict, the First Dáil imposed a boycott on goods produced in Belfast from 6 August 1920, which proved to be ineffective.
Instead of sending the controversial Black and Tans into Northern Ireland, the British government replaced the now-defunct Royal Irish Constabulary with a special constabulary that would eventually evolve into the Royal Ulster Constabulary.
In Northern Ireland, an auxiliary police force, the then called Ulster Special Constabulary, was recruited for counter-insurgency purposes. This police force consisted of 3 tiers of servicemen. The A Specials were uniformed and paid. The B Specials were uniformed volunteers patrolling mostly their own areas, and the C Specials were a reserve unit. From the onset, the USC was almost exclusively Protestant, with members of the pre-war UVF and its commanders joining the B Specials. When the constabulary was placed under the control of the Northern Ireland government, Craig expanded the B Specials in an effort to re-establish order in the country. On 29 April 1922, King George V granted to the police force the title of Royal Ulster Constabulary. Meanwhile, the IRA actions in Belfast, such as the killing of policemen, resulted in more retaliation attacks directly on the Roman Catholic population by Loyalists, sometimes covertly aided by state forces. Atrocities and assassinations were perpetrated by both sides across Belfast. The McMahon murders of 26 March 1922, and the Arnun Street massacre of a week later, in which uniformed police shot a total of 12 Catholic civilians dead in reprisal for the killings of policemen, were 2 of the worst incidents.
On the 22nd of May, the IRA assassinated Unionist politician William Twaddell, in Belfast. Immediately afterwards, the Special Powers Act was passed in an effort to stop the chaos. Internment was introduced and over 350 IRA men were arrested in Belfast, crippling its organisation there. In June 1922, after the treaty was approved by public referendum, the Republican movement in the South split into 2 warring factions, the pro-treaty and anti-treaty forces, marking the beginning of the Irish Civil War that would last almost a year and result in several war crimes and travesties between Southern Irishmen. In the North, the cycle of sectarian atrocities against civilians in Belfast continued into summer 1922. May saw 75 people killed in Belfast and another 30 died there in June. Several thousand Catholics fled the violence and sought refuge in Glasgow and Dublin. However, after this crisis, the violence declined rapidly. Only 6 people lost their lives in July and August, and the final conflict-related killing took place in October 1922. 2 factors contributed to the rapid end to the conflict during this period. The first was the collapse of the Northern IRA as a result of internment. The second was the outbreak of the Irish Civil War in the South, which diverted the IRA's attention from the Northern Ireland to the Free State, largely ending the violence in the former while increasing in the latter. The death toll in Northern Ireland between July 1920 and July 1922 was 557 men, women and children. 303 were Catholics, 172 Protestants and 82 members of the security forces. In Belfast, 236 people had been killed in the first months of 1922, but there was not a single sectarian murder in the city between 1923 and 1933. Northern Ireland was believed to have one of the lowest crime rates in Europe during this period. Unionist dominance, the Boundary Commission and the Great Depression in 1922, the Northern Ireland government sought to establish its authority. It started by suppressing 21 nationalist local authorities who had pledged their allegiance to the Dáil. In July, legislation was rushed through to abolish proportional representation in local government elections. This went unchecked by Westminster as Prime Minister David Lloyd George was preoccupied with dealing with divisions his coalition government and was unwilling to intervene. As nationalist groups refused to cooperate with the NI government, Unionists found themselves in a position of determining how electoral districts without being challenged. This freehand would result in blatant gerrymandering in favor of the Unionist Party. For example, in one district, Nationalists cast 5,381 more votes than Unionists, but the electoral boundaries gave Unionists a majority of 18 seats over Nationalists. Joseph Devlin, the MP from West Belfast, concluded that Nationalists could no longer afford to abstain from taking their seats, effectively giving Unionists free rein, and he decided to attend the NI Parliament to mitigate any further damage. Article 12 of the Anglo-Irish Treaty allowed for a boundary commission to be set up to review the current territories of Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State. After the Irish Civil War ended, James Cosgrave, the leader of the Irish government, sought to invoke Article 12. Owen MacNeill was appointed to represent the Free State. Most nationalists expected large areas of Northern Ireland to be turned over to the Free State. In April 1925, James Craig called a snap election to demonstrate Unionist solidarity against the Boundary Commission, using the now famous catchphrase, "Not an inch."
But Article 12 proved to be too vague, making provisions for the will of the people as well as economic and geographical ties. The argument was then made that Derry and Newry were too financially bound to Belfast to be separated and therefore had to stay in the 6 counties. A leaked report was published in the Morning Post newspaper on 7 November 1925 detailing the conclusions of the Commission. Parts of Donegal and Monaghan were conceded to Northern Ireland with only the town of Crossmaglen given to the Free State. The population of Knee would ultimately be reduced by only 1.8%. McNeill resigned in protest. Cosgrave and Craig rushed to London to meet with the new Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, where they agreed to suppress the Boundary Commission and keep the border as it was. In December 1925, Craig returned to a hero's welcome in Belfast, where shipbuilders presented him with a gold-mounted portion of a foot rule for the inch he had not surrendered. The idioms, "not an inch," as well as "no surrender," would become popular sayings among Unionists, particularly Loyalists, in Northern Ireland. In 1928, 10 nationalists sat in the Northern Ireland Commons and, yet, received no acclaim for their willingness to cooperate and returning to their seats. The only bill the Nationalists got through from 1928 to 1972 was the Wild Birds Protection Act. In 1929, James Craig abolished proportional representation in parliamentary elections. Though the impact was most felt by smaller parties, Nationalists considered this another harsh measure to oppress the minority. 3 years later, speaking in the Commons, Joseph Devlin castigated the Unionist Party for snubbing the willingness of nationalists to cooperate, favoring old party lines, and treating 1/3 of the population as political pariahs. The economic boom from World War I had dissipated by 1922 and 23% of Northern Ireland was now unemployed. No one had predicted the economic slump and, while some blamed the Unionist government, this issue is now believed to have resulted from Westminster not giving Northern Ireland enough power over their own financial policy. There were similar effects being felt in Britain as the Great War had changed the nature of international trade. The 1929 stock market crash in New York had wide-reaching effects around the world in places like Northern Ireland. Economic interests in the province, particularly large industries like shipbuilding, were hit hard. In Belfast, Harland and Wolff did not launch a single ship between December 1931 to May 1934. By January 1933, the volume of international trade was only 1/3 of what it had been before the crash. Workman, Clark and Company shipyard closed down permanently in 1935. In early 1932, sectarian tensions rose with the alarm of the Unionist community as Eamon de Valera assumed the premiership of Free State Ireland. Then, when the Church of Ireland announced plans to commemorate the coming of St. Patrick to Ireland, a Catholic cardinal commented publicly that the Protestant Church in Ireland, and the same is true anywhere else, is not only not the rightful representative of the early Irish Church, but it is not even a part of the Church of Christ. This brought Protestant outrage, pushing tensions to the breaking point, and Loyalists responded in June 1932 by attacking Catholic pilgrims returning to Belfast on public transport from the Eucharistic Congress in Dublin. Denouncements of Catholicism grew louder as the Loyalist summer marching season came closer. The situation was made worse by the fact that many of Northern Ireland's unemployed were in a state of privation and some were even starving. On 30 September 1932, MPs in Northern Ireland's House of Commons shouted in protest over the 78,000 unemployed and their lack of food. One MP threw the mace on the floor and accused the House of engaging in hypocrisy. On 3 October 1932, 60,000 unemployed Catholics and Protestants marched together in solidarity to a torch-lit rally at the Custom House. The bands who marched alongside the protesters were careful not play any sectarian songs and instead opted to perform the popular tune, "Yes, We Have No Bananas." On the 11th of October, crowds formed up on Templemore Avenue in East Belfast and began to march. The police, drawing their batons, were given the order to charge and stormed into the crowds. Some marchers were beaten, many fled. Rioting broke out on the Lower Falls Road and police, armed with rifles, fired and mortally wounded one Catholic and one Protestant.
News spread to the nearby Shankill Road, a traditionally loyalist area, where a woman in a shawl was quoted by a reporter from the Irish press as shouting, "They're kicking the shite out of the peelers up the falls. Are yous going to let them down?" Shankill Protestants ran the few blocks to aid the mostly Catholic rioters against the police in a rare episode of non-sectarian unity.
Shocked, the government conceded to their demands and increased aid to the unemployed of Northern Ireland, pacifying the population. As the largest city in Ulster, Belfast became the capital of Northern Ireland, and a Grand Parliament building was finished at Stormont Estate in 1932. The government of Northern Ireland was dominated by upper and middle-class Unionists. Being out of touch with the working class, many of the needs of low-income families went unaddressed. Conditions in the poorer parts of Belfast remained bad, with many houses being damp, overcrowded and lacking in basic amenities such as hot water and indoor toilets until about the 1970s.
In 1933, tensions again were heightened as a Unionist MP, referencing the comments made by the Catholic cardinal the previous year, challenged Protestants of Ulster to only hire other Protestants. The speech was condemned by a Catholic MP who sought an official rebuke. When the Catholic MP appealed to Lord Craigavon, the Prime Minister simply remarked that he did not know of one person who did not agree with the sentiments of the Unionist MP. Craigavon went on to state that he was an Orange man first and a politician and member of this Parliament afterwards. The honourable member must remember that, in the South, they boasted of a Catholic state. All that I boast is that we are Protestant Parliament and a Protestant state. The year 1935 saw another summer of tension as the Church of Ireland Bishop of Down appealed to the public to forget the unhappy past, and endeavour to work together. In response, at the Belmont Field, Orange Order Grand Master Sir Joseph Davidson asked rhetorically, "Are we to forget that the flag of empire is described as foreign flag? And our beloved king insulted by Mr. de Valera? Are we to forget that the aim of these people is to establish an all-Ireland, Roman Catholic state in which Protestantism is to be crushed out of existence?" That night, as the observers at Belmont Field returned to Belfast, fierce fighting broke out on York Street, which raged for days. When calm returned, 8 Protestants and 5 Catholics had been killed and 2,000 Catholics had been driven from their homes. When Eamon de Valera unveiled his constitution in 1937, Articles 2 and 3 stated that the government in Dublin had the right to exercise jurisdiction over the entire island of Ireland. The constitution also recognized the validity of the Protestant Church and others, however, it gave special status to the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland. Craigavon called for a general election in 1938 to show his contempt for the Irish constitution, with the Unionists winning a crushing majority over nationalists and others. By February 1938, nearly a third of industrial workers were unemployed. Eyewitnesses recall seeing barefoot children at the Albert Bridge pens in Belfast hoping to get unwanted, unsterilised milk before the cattle was shipped to England. Belfast Corporation would only build 2,000 council houses between the World Wars, and many were built with inferior materials amidst accusations of corruption. Malnutrition was also a major issue for families both in the Free State and Northern Ireland, with a 9.6% infant mortality rate in Belfast, compared with 5.9% in Sheffield, England. It was stated in Stormont that maternity was more dangerous in Northern Ireland than in England or the Free State, with maternal mortality rising by a fifth between 1922 and 1938. Tuberculosis was also a concern, killing many young people in Belfast and other areas. Second World War. During the Second World War, Belfast was one of the major cities in the United Kingdom bombed by German forces. The British government had thought that Northern Ireland would be safe from German bombing because of its distance from German positions, and so very little was done to prepare Belfast for air raids. Few bomb shelters were built and the few anti-aircraft guns the city possessed were sent to England. The Belfast Blitz occurred on Easter Tuesday 15 April 1941, when 200 German Luftwaffe bombers attacked the city, pounding working-class areas of Belfast around the shipyards and North Belfast in particular, the New Lodge and Antrim Road areas. About 1,000 people died and many more were injured. Of Belfast's housing stock, 52% was destroyed. Outside London, this was the greatest loss of life in a single raid during the war. Roughly 100,000 of the population of 415,000 became homeless. Belfast was targeted due to its concentration of heavy shipbuilding and aerospace industries.
Ironically, during the same period the local economy made a recovery as the war economy saw great demand for the products of these industries. The Troubles' main article. The Troubles. The post-war years were relatively placid in Belfast, but economic decline and sectarian tensions added to resentment among the Catholic population as widespread discrimination festered below the surface. Inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement, and Martin Luther King Jr. in particular, Catholics and Protestants formed the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. The NICRA's stated goals included equal housing rights, voting rights, proportional representation and an end to job discrimination. Many Unionists and Loyalists feared the NICRA and similar groups were a front for a more subversive movement whose real aims were to destabilise the state of Northern Ireland. Citing examples like Michael Collins' Northern IRA campaign to undermine the Belfast government during the Anglo-Irish War, Protestants in the 1960s feared Catholics would attempt to topple the Northern Ireland government in hopes that the country would become a failed state, be severed from the United Kingdom and subsequently join with the Republic of Ireland. These fears were exacerbated as protest marches and demonstrations were organised across the country. One such march in August 1969 near Derry was violently broken up by the RUC. The melee was filmed and broadcast on the evening news. In the immediate aftermath, violence erupted across the country and sectarian rioting broke out in the city of Belfast. The perceived one-sidedness of the police and the failure of the IRA to defend Catholic neighbourhoods of the city was one of the main causes for the schism in the IRA. The discord caused a split that resulted in the older leadership continuing as the official IRA and the formation of the more militant Provisional Irish Republican Army headed by a new generation of Irish Republicans. The PIRA or Provos would subsequently launch an armed campaign against security forces, British infrastructure, the state of Northern Ireland as well as targeting Great Britain. The violence intensified in the early 1970s, with rival paramilitary groups being formed on both sides. Bombings, assassinations and street violence formed a backdrop to everyday life throughout the Troubles. The British Army was deployed in 1969 as a peacekeeping force. Originally seen as protectors against Protestant aggression, Catholic opinion shifted when the army was ordered to support RUC weapons raids on nationalists' homes. Incidents such as the Falls Curfew of July 1970 further worsened relations between the army and working-class Catholics. In the early 1970s, there were huge forced population movements as families, mostly but not exclusively Roman Catholic, living in areas dominated by the other community were intimidated from their homes, either directly or indirectly through general fear. As recently as 1971 the city and surrounding area had a large Protestant majority, but as of 2011 is almost evenly balanced. This fundamental change in balance has been attributed to higher Catholic birth rates and rising prosperity, together with Protestant emigration. The Ulster Volunteer Force killed 15 people in the McGurk's bar bombing in 1971. In response to the event's Bloody Sunday, the PIRA detonated 22 bombs, all in a confined area in Belfast city centre in 1972, on what is known as Bloody Friday, killing 9 people. Loyalist paramilitaries, the Ulster Volunteer Force and Ulster Defence Association under the guise of the Ulster Freedom Fighters retaliated against the PIRA campaign by killing Catholics at random from around August 1972 onward. The majority of those in both Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries were also on benefit during the Troubles, making it the only time when the United Kingdom technically financially supported both sides during a conflict, albeit inadvertently. A particularly notorious group, based on the Shankill Road in the mid-1970s, would torture, mutilate and kill Catholic and, occasionally, Protestant victims. They became known as the Shankill Butchers. The army occupied huge fortified barracks, some of which were constructed in predominantly nationalist West Belfast. Any remnant of goodwill evaporated when the army fought a 3-day gun battle with the official IRA in the Falls Road area, resulting in 4 deaths. Major confrontation continued between the security forces and Republican paramilitaries throughout the 1970s and 80s, notably in Operation Motorman in 1972, when the army retook nationalist no-go areas in Belfast and elsewhere. The general decline in European manufacturing industry of the early 1980s, exacerbated by political violence, devastated the city's economy.
In 1981, Bobby Sands, a native of Greater Belfast, was the first of 10 Republican prisoners to die on hunger strike in pursuit of political status.
The event provoked major rioting in nationalist areas of the city. Compelled by civic strife, failed government initiatives and the Christian principle of peacemaking, Catholic priests Father Alec Reid and Father Jerry Reynolds of Clonard Monastery decided to attempt a grassroots peace process. Realizing that many of the relevant leaders would lose the support of their constituencies were it known that they were negotiating, the would-be peace process was kept secret. Clandestine meetings were arranged in a side room of Clonard between John Hume and Gerry Adams speaking for Sinn Féin and the more extreme Republican movement. When terms were agreed on the Catholic side, Protestant leaders were invited into the talks. Not being comfortable meeting in a Catholic institution, Unionist and Loyalist leaders met with Reid and Reynolds in a private home in a mixed area on the Springfield Road. The secret peace talks were unknowingly threatened during a series of notorious incidents that took place within 2 weeks in 1988. Firstly, 3 IRA members were killed in Gibraltar by the SAS in what Republicans termed as an assassination. Their remains were returned to Belfast where the funeral for the slain IRA members was attacked by Loyalist Michael Stone. Then, the following week at the funerals of Stone's victims, 2 off-duty soldiers were lynched in the corporal's killings. Father Alec Reid was photographed grievously administering the last rites before unsuccessfully pleading with a gunman to spare their lives. However, instead of derailing the peace talks, these events added extra fervor for leaders to seek reconciliation, culminating in the ceasefires of 1994 and the ultimate peace deal of the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. In the early 1990s, Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries in the city stepped up their killings of each other and enemy civilians. A cycle of killing continued right up to the PIRA ceasefire in August 1994 and the combined Loyalist military command cessation 6 weeks later. The most horrific single attack of this period came in October 1993, when the PIRA bombed a fish shop on the Shankill Road in an attempt to kill the UDA leadership. The Shankill Road bombing instead killed 9 Protestant shoppers as well as one of the bombers. Despite the paramilitary ceasefires of 1994, today the city still remains scarred by the conflict between the two communities. In all, nearly 1,500 people have been killed in political violence in the city from 1969 until the present. Most of Belfast is highly segregated with enclaves of one community surrounded by another feeling under siege. Fitful paramilitary activity continues, often directed inwards as in the Loyalist feuds and the killing of Catholic Robert McCartney by PIRA members in December 2004. In 1997, Unionists lost control of Belfast City Council for the first time in its history, with the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland gaining the balance of power between Nationalists and Unionists. This position was confirmed in the council elections of 2001 and 2005. Since then it has had 2 Catholic mayors, one from the Social Democratic and Labour Party and one from Sinn Féin. Recent history 2005 present the city in general has seen significant redevelopment and investment since the Good Friday Agreement. The formation of the Laganside Corporation in 1989 heralded the start of the regeneration of the River Lagan and its surrounding areas. Other areas that have been transformed include the Cathedral Quarter and the Victoria Square area. However, communal segregation has continued since then, with occasional low-level street violence in isolated flashpoints and the construction of new peace lines. Belfast saw the worst of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. However, since the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, there has been major redevelopment in the city including Victoria Square, the Titanic Quarter and Laganside as well as the Odyssey Complex and the landmark Waterfront Hall. In 2013 protests and riots broke out by disillusioned Unionists following a change of law about the Union Jack flown on the City Hall. Collapse and restoration of Stormont in January 2017. The Stormont executive collapsed after the power-sharing leadership of the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin found themselves at an impasse over the perceived lack of accountability regarding the renewable heating incentive scandal. In the wake of the RHI scandal, Sinn Féin stated that they would not continue in the power-sharing executive unless legislation for Irish Language Act was implemented. When the DUP refused, Deputy First Minister Martin McGuinness resigned his post and did not nominate a replacement, triggering the suspension of the Northern Ireland Assembly.
Stormont remained closed until January 2020 when the DUP and Sinn Féin agreed on terms just days before an election was due to be called.
COVID-19 Northern Ireland confirmed its first case of COVID-19 during the coronavirus pandemic on 27 February 2020 and its first death from the virus on 19 March. On 23 March, Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced a UK-wide, stay-at-home order effectively starting the UK lockdown. Travel restrictions and social distancing measures were implemented at various levels of strictness with ongoing policy reviews. General restrictions began to be eased in Northern Ireland beginning in July 2021. Stormont leaders were meant to gather and discuss the fate of the remaining rules in Northern Ireland on 15 September 2021, but the meeting had to be postponed after Sinn Féin leader Michelle O'Neill tested positive for COVID-19. Spring Riots 2021. On 30 March 2021, riots began in the Unionist Tullyalley estate in the waterside area of Derry.
Some Loyalists and Unionist groups argued against the Irish Sea border creating trade barriers between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom as a result of Brexit. This, combined with the closure of youth centres due to COVID-19 and the decision by the Police Service of Northern Ireland to not prosecute the Sinn Féin politicians who attended IRA Head of Intelligence Bobby Story's funeral, resulted in social unrest in Derry which quickly spread throughout the country. First Minister Arlene Foster publicly called for PSNI Chief Constable Simon Byrne to resign, which he refused. Riots started in Belfast on 2 April 2021 in the Sandy Row area after nearby Newtonabbey and Carrickfergus experienced unrest. The rioting erupted after Loyalist protesters began to attack police with projectiles including bricks, bottles and petrol bombs. The ages of the rioters were estimated at between 13 and 25 with 8 people being arrested including a 13-year-old boy. On 7 April, a metro bus was hijacked and emptied of its driver and passengers before being set alight on the junction of the Shankill Road and Lanark Way, a staunchly Loyalist area. At the nearby Peace Wall, youth from both the Loyalist and Republican sides threw missiles over and directly at the closed metal gate. The next day, on 8 April, rioting again broke out on the other side of the Peace Wall in the Republican area of the Springfield Road in an alleged response to violence on the Loyalist side. Over 200 rioters, many of them youths wearing COVID-19 face coverings, swarmed the closed Peacegate on Lanark Way in an effort to get through to the other side. Fearing escalation should the Loyalist youths get into a direct confrontation with the Republican youths, police reinforced the gate to ensure that the two groups of rioters remained separate and on their respective sides of the wall. Unable to breach the Peacegate into the Loyalist Shankill area, rioters began to divert up the Springfield Road where they clashed with a line of police in riot gear. A crowd of neighborhood residents and media appeared on the periphery of the riot, many of the former standing in silent disapproval of violence in their community. The group of rioters ebbed and flowed up and down the street until police eventually set up a containment line near the entrances of Springfield Dam Park and Belfast Met Springfield campus on the one side and the Innovation Factory on the other. Bricks and bottles were thrown at the police and some of the rioters attempted to throw petrol bombs, though many of these failed to light. At one point, police produced a handful of K-9 police dogs in an effort to deter and disperse the rioters. These dogs were not used in the end and were kept on their leads. In a further effort to discourage the rioters, police deployed 2 mounted water cannon vehicles. The water cannons were presented behind the police line but were not used for over an hour as warnings were issued to the crowd. Eventually, the order was given for the water cannons to be used in hopes that they would quell the riot. This was the first time in 6 years that a police water cannon had to be used in Northern Ireland. Unable to withstand the blasts of high-pressure water, the crowd of rioters slowly disintegrated and order was restored in the later evening. During the turmoil, 19 officers and 1 police dog were reported injured. The rioting, however, lost momentum on 9 April when Loyalist leaders cancelled further protests, out of respect for the royal family upon the death of Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Without participation from the Loyalists, Republican areas had lost any pretense of rioting in response to the other side. Though there was some further agitation in the Tigers Bay area of North Belfast and also the town of Coleraine, the unrest in Loyalist and Republican areas had largely dissipated. In the aftermath,
Politicians and community spokespeople from both sides almost unanimously condemned the violence and appealed for calm, wisdom and unity. On 27 April 2021, Arlene Foster was compelled by her party, the DUP, to resign after being given a letter of no confidence over her handling of the riots and her perceived moderate stance on the Northern Ireland Protocol. She resigned the next day and was replaced by Edwin Poots as DUP leader, who himself named Paul Givan to succeed as first Minsider after Foster.